Sweep it clean in there. Food stuck everywhere. The entire Fort Bragg hangar burst into laughter as Elias Grant, a ragged, impoverished old veteran, was shoved with a broom beneath an Apache helicopter worth tens of millions of dollars. No one called him by rank. No one remembered who he once was. To them, he was merely trash, kept around to fill a personnel quota. In his hand was an old silver ring, its engraving faded with the words, "Duty First." They thought it was a cheap souvenir from a man long past his prime, until, just a few seconds later, the Apache's engine screamed and then died. The second startup attempt failed. Warning lights flared bright red. Technicians panicked. The commander began swearing, and at that very moment, the colonel walked in. He did not look at the Apache. He stared straight at the man holding the broom. Second Lieutenant Elias Grant. Step forward. The entire hangar fell into dead silence, because the name that had just been called did not belong to a janitor. It belonged to the man who once repaired Apaches in the middle of the battlefield, and who carried a secret powerful enough to burn the entire system to the ground. If you were Elias, humiliated, and pushed to the margins, would you stay silent to survive, or stand up and drag everyone down with you? Subscribe to the channel if you believe the truth is not for cowards. Comment, would you choose silence, or speak out? Fort Bragg, North Carolina, autumn of 2025. The Apache hangar stood wide open like a steel rib cage, where cold air clung to the skin, and the smell of jet fuel thickened every breath. White lights poured down on toil-stained dead concrete, reflecting the still, orderly, expensive AH-64 Echo helicopters, familiar to those in uniform rather than to a man holding a broom. Elias Grant pushed a floor sweeper cart along dark oil streaks beneath the belly of an Apache. The wheels rattled, the broom scraped against metal, producing a dry, repetitive sound. He moved slowly, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if that rhythm had been nailed into his body long ago. His skin was dark, his frame thin, his back slightly hunched from dull aches that had lingered for years. No one asked where he came from. No one noticed him pass by. A young officer standing nearby glanced over, the corner of his mouth curling upward. He turned to a fellow soldier, his voice just loud enough to cut through the machinery noise. "How long has this old man been around here?" The other shrugged. "No idea. Probably since the base hadn't even changed its paint yet." A brief laugh broke out, short and sharp. Elias heard it, but he did not lift his head. His hand tightened slightly around the broom handle, then relaxed. He kept pushing the cart, gathering oil patches and bits of metal, doing the work that everyone here took for granted someone had to do. Above him, the Apache bearing the number 19042 filled the space. Its body was coated in dull gray paint, its sharp lines seeming carved from a single block of steel. To the squadron, it was a source of pride, something mentioned in reports, meetings, and speeches about performance. To Elias, it was a shape so familiar that a single glance revealed every curve and angle. Commands rang out from the front of the hangar. The voice was firm, accustomed to being obeyed. Technicians moved faster, exchanged brief words, clipped and precise. Everything passed over Elias like wind through an invisible object. No one signaled for him to move aside, because in their minds, he was not really there. A young technician stepped backward without looking, his heel striking the sweeper cart. He spun around, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Move it, you're in the way." Elias pulled the cart aside, backing up against the yellow painted line on the floor. He gave a small nod, said nothing. The technician shook his head and turned away, as if he had just avoided an insignificant obstacle. For a brief moment, Elias looked up. His gaze traveled along the Apache's body, paused at the engine bay, at the joints, the wiring hidden beneath the shell. It was not a curious look. It was the familiarity of someone who had once been very close to this machine, who had touched it in situations where there was no room for mistakes. "What are you staring at?" Another voice snapped, edged with annoyance. "Don't stand there daydreaming. Do your job." Elias returned to his broom. He pushed the cart onward, the rhythm steady. Inside the hangar, the clatter of metal, the placement of tools, the thud of boots on concrete blended into a constant backdrop. No one noticed that the floor sweeper knew exactly when to step aside to avoid interfering with a technical procedure, and when he could move in to clean an area that had just been opened. At a corner of the wall, Elias paused briefly to rest. He leaned on the broom handle and took a deep breath. On his left hand, an old silver ring caught the light. The words "duty first" were faded, but still readable if one looked closely. A young technician passed by and glanced down at that hand. "Nice ring," he said, half joking, half curious. "A souvenir," Elias replied after a short pause. "An oath, an oath," the other chuckled. "Everyone here has an oath, but not everyone still remembers it." He walked away, leaving Elias alone with the lights and the machinery. Elias gently turned the ring, feeling its familiar cold surface. Some things did not need to be spoken aloud, especially in a place where words were often swallowed by something called order. Another officer walked past, looked Elias up and down, then turned to the person beside him. "A janitor, yeah. Make sure he doesn't touch the aircraft. This stuff isn't for people like that." The comment was delivered lightly, like a technical remark. Elias heard it. He did not react. He had heard such words long enough to understand that reacting only made things more troublesome. He bent down, picked up a small piece of metal that had fallen near the wheel, and placed it into the trash tray. The work continued. Time flowed with the rhythm of sweeping, pushing, and the footsteps of others. If anyone had paid closer attention, they might have noticed that Elias always lingered longer beneath the Apache, numbered 19042. Not to admire it, just an old habit, hard to break, but no one noticed. At Fort Bragg, anything without rank or power was easy to overlook. As the shift neared its end, Elias pushed the cart back to the storage area. The lights in the hangar softened slightly, less harsh. He stopped and took one last look at the line of Apaches standing in formation. In the eyes of others, they were assets, symbols. In his eyes, they were machines that had once depended on human hands and decisions. Elias turned away. The hangar doors closed behind him with a heavy, resonant metallic sound. No one called his name. No one asked who he had once been, and no one at Fort Bragg knew that the man who had just swept the floor out of that hangar had once repaired the very helicopters they now revered. In days when a single small mistake was enough to ensure that no one came back, the morning at Fort Bragg began with the steady thud of boots striking the concrete floor of the hangar. That sound was different from the footsteps of technicians or pilots. It was firmer, heavier, carrying with it the habit of giving orders. When Derek Voss appeared at the hangar entrance, no introduction was needed. Everyone knew their commander had arrived. Voss was young for the position he held. His uniform fit perfectly, crisp and flat, insignia gleaming under the lights. He walked slowly, letting his eyes sweep over each person, as if checking off an invisible list. When that gaze reached Elias, it lingered for a beat longer, long enough to carry a clear sense of irritation. Elias was pushing a floor-sweeping cart along the edge of the technical area, cleaning up oil stains that had not yet fully dried. He felt that gaze even before he heard the voice. "Who gave you permission to stand in the technical area?" Voss's voice rang out, sharp and cold, slicing through the air. The entire hangar seemed to sink. A few technicians froze mid-movement, then quickly bent back down to their work, as if they had heard nothing at all. Elias lifted his head, keeping his posture just straight enough. "I'm only following my assignment." Voss took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He looked at the sweeping cart, at the broom, then straight at Elias. The corner of his mouth curled up, not into a smile, but into a reflex of contempt. "Your assignment is to sweep it clean," Voss said slowly, each word dropping like a cold pebble. "Not to stand around staring at expensive equipment." A few quiet laughs sounded from behind, quick and short. Elias heard them. He stayed silent, his hand tightening around the broom handle. He knew this tone well. It did not require an answer. It required the other person to lower their head. Voss turned to the whole team, pointing down at the oil-stained concrete. "Look," he said louder, as if lecturing. "This unit exists because of discipline, and discipline starts with everyone knowing their place." He turned back to Elias. "Move it along, old man. You're embarrassing this unit." No one spoke. No one's eyes dared to linger too long. At Fort Bragg, everyone understood that stepping into moments like this only made you the next target. Silence spread, thick and heavy, smothering any possible reaction. Elias bent down. He pulled the sweeping cart toward the oil stain and resumed the familiar motions. His back was slightly more hunched than before, not from fear, but because his body had grown used to carrying words like these. His spine was rigid, his breathing steady to keep his hands from shaking. A technician standing nearby glanced at Voss, then at Elias. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but in the end only lowered his head and pretended to check a cable. The choice took place in a split second, and he chose safety. Voss remained there a moment longer, as if to make sure the message had been fully delivered. He gave a small nod, satisfied. As he turned away, he dropped a final line, his voice low enough to feel personal, but clear enough for Elias to hear. When your time is over, you should know your place. There was no anger in the sentence. There was certainty. Certainty that his position allowed him to speak that way, and certainty that no consequences would follow. Voss walked toward the command office, his boots continuing to strike the floor with a steady, confident rhythm. Behind him, the hangar slowly returned to its usual sounds, tools clanking, voices calling out, machines humming. What had just happened was folded away and stored, like a detail not worth remembering. Elias kept sweeping. He moved along the row of Apache helicopters, keeping just enough distance to avoid bothering anyone. When he passed aircraft 19042, he paused for a brief moment, just long enough for his eyes to glide over the fuselage. Then he moved on. A young technician approached, speaking quietly, his voice awkward. Don't take it personally. Major Voss is just picky. Elias looked at him, his expression calm. Do your job. The young man nodded and walked away quickly, as if afraid of being seen talking to him for too long. Elias watched him go, then returned to the broom. He knew the difference between being picky and deliberately humiliating someone, but he also knew that saying it out loud here would change nothing. In the distance, Voss stood with a group of officers, his voice clear and confident. I don't want to see any disorder today. Everything must be up to standard. We are a model unit. One officer nodded. Understood, sir. Another chuckled lightly. Don't worry. Minor distractions won't affect the report. Voss smiled, satisfied. He knew how to build his image, how to turn order into a perfect facade. To him, Elias was only a small detail, an extra object in the larger picture he was painting. Elias pushed the cart toward the end of the hangar. He stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, then placed the broom back on its rack. On his hand, an old silver ring reflected the overhead lights. The words, "Duty first," appeared faintly, but still clear enough for him to read. He looked around the hangar one last time. The busy people, the commands that had just echoed, the eyes that had just looked away. Together, they formed an invisible wall, protecting people in positions like Derek Voss. Elias turned away, carrying his silence with him. He knew that in this place, silence was not emptiness. It was a shield, and that shield was protecting a kind of power that liked to step on the weak. The short break came after a heavy morning. The hangar settled down, the sound of tools thinned out, and a few people left the technical area to look for coffee. Elias sat in the corner near the side door, where the lights were less harsh. He leaned the broom against the cart, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The space felt quieter, but the smell of fuel still lingered, clinging stubbornly, like an old memory. The stillness did not erase the weight of the morning. It only softened the edges of it. A young technician walked past, then slowed when he noticed Elias sitting alone. The man glanced down at Elias's left hand, where an old silver ring reflected a faint light. He lowered his voice, as if afraid someone else might hear. You keep that ring because you miss your soldier days, he asked. His tone carried more curiosity than respect. The question lingered briefly between them. Elias did not answer right away. He looked toward the row of Apache helicopters before speaking, his voice low and brief. Because of a promise, the words were plain and carried no explanation. They were not meant to invite further discussion. The technician raised an eyebrow and gave a soft laugh. A promise doesn't feed anyone, old man. The words were tossed out lightly, like an obvious truth repeated too many times in this place. It was the kind of remark people made without thinking. Here, survival often meant practicality above all else. Elias slowly turned the ring. The words "duty first" had faded, several letters nearly sunken into the scratched silver surface. He ran his thumb across each letter, a gesture so familiar he did not need to look. The comment did not offend him. It only reminded him how quickly the distance between people once in the same formation could stretch when time and circumstance changed. The sounds of the hangar suddenly blurred, as if pushed far away. In Elias's mind, other images surfaced: red lights inside a helicopter cabin, rapid warning alarms, the aircraft shaking from incoming fire. A decision made in a split second, between replacing a module or cutting power to save what remained. He remembered how his hand had trembled slightly as he turned the switch, and the pilot's voice behind him, tense, yet trusting. Then the engine roared back. The helicopter held altitude, and they made it home. The memory ended there, clean and sharp. It carried relief, but also a quiet weight. Those moments never truly disappeared. The memories came and went quickly, leaving behind a familiar emptiness. Elias opened his eyes. In front of him was still the Fort Bragg hangar, still the silent Apache airframes. He lifted his gaze to Apache 19042. His eyes lingered longer on the engine compartment, recognizing details only those who had lived with these machines could see. "You all right?" the technician asked again, his tone less playful now. Elias nodded. "I'm fine. You should head back. Break's almost over." The words were calm and final. There was no invitation to continue the conversation. The technician nodded and walked away, quickening his pace when someone called out from afar. Elias stayed behind, alone. He leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, letting it slow. The cold ring on his hand reminded him that some things had been entrusted, even if no one around still remembered them. On the other side of the hangar, Derek Voss stood at a temporary desk, signing paperwork. He held the pen firmly, each line neat and controlled. Another officer stood beside him, speaking quietly about the upcoming inspection schedule. Voss nodded, his eyes never leaving the file. "Maintenance reports all good?" the other man asked. "All good," Voss replied. "Everything is under control." He turned to the next page and added another signature. Numbers and lines of text were arranged cleanly, leaving no room for hesitation. For Voss, order on paper was proof enough that everything was functioning as it should. Elias watched from a distance. The space between them was not large, only several dozen meters within the same hangar, but the distance in position, in voice, and in decision-making power was different. Elias returned his attention to the ring, turning it once more, as if checking a familiar lock. Nearby, laughter rose from a group of technicians returning to work. The conversation shifted to other topics, about shifts and rare time off. No one mentioned the old man in the corner. Elias stood up and picked up the broom again. He knew the break was ending, and his work would continue as it always did. Before walking away, he looked once more toward Apache 19042. His gaze settled calmly, as if committing something to memory. Then he turned his back and pushed the cleaning cart toward a fresh oil stain. The familiar rhythm returned, steady and slow. Another technician passed by and spoke casually. "You always carry that ring with you." "Yeah," Elias replied. "It reminds me who I am." The man chuckled lightly and did not ask more. At Fort Bragg, questions like that rarely went further. Elias kept working, gathering what others overlooked. The work was repetitive, but his thoughts were not. He knew the ring was not just a keepsake. It was tied to decisions that had been recorded, to repairs carried out under conditions where mistakes meant death. It was bound to an oath spoken when he was young, in a different room, with different people. In the distance, Voss closed the file and set the pen down. He spoke to his subordinate, his voice firm. "Prepare for the inspection. I want everything to look perfect." "Yes, sir." The exchange was crisp and unquestioned. Elias heard it. He bent down, picked up a small piece of trash, and dropped it into the tray. On his hand, the old silver ring remained, silent. If someone were curious enough to ask deeper, patient enough to listen, they might understand that the oath Elias spoke of had never expired. But at Fort Bragg, curiosity often ends early. Elias pushed the cleaning cart onward, leaving behind the corner where he had been sitting. The ring on his hand held more than what others could see. It not only preserves memory, it held something that, if revealed at the right moment, could destroy the career of someone who believed himself safely protected. If you believe some oaths never expire, please press subscribe. The morning of the inspection arrived faster than the entire hangar felt ready for. The alarm rang out sharply, pulling a wave of tension through Fort Bragg. Fragmented conversations came to an abrupt stop. Footsteps grew quicker. No one spoke loudly. Yet everyone understood that today was the day when even the smallest mistake could be magnified into a serious problem. The Apache with tail number 19042 was rolled into the center position. Under the lights, the cold gray fuselage looked flawless, as if it had never carried a scratch or a complicated history hidden within. The pilot approached and exchanged a brief conversation with the maintenance crew. Everything unfolded exactly according to procedure, just as it had been rehearsed many times before. Elias stood at the edge of the hangar, beside the floor sweeper. He had not been told to leave, but no one paid attention to his presence either. The spot was far enough not to interfere, close enough to observe. He watched the Apache with quiet focus, his eyes not on the people, but fixed on the aircraft itself. The pilot climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed. An arm lifted in a signal. Inside, the motions were fast and efficient. The familiar sounds of the startup sequence echoed through the hangar, steady and confident. Then the engine screeched. The sound was not as smooth as usual. It stretched a beat longer, rose higher, then cut off abruptly. Silence came fast and heavy, as if someone had just pulled the breath out of the entire hangar. Red warning lights flooded the control panel. The pilot leaned forward to check the readings, his voice tense over the intercom. Stability signal lost. Recheck. Technicians rushed in. One bent over the connection panel. Another stared at the diagnostic screen. Fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. A hurried voice broke out. Reset the system. The command was carried out almost immediately. Parameters restarted from the beginning. Screens flickered. Inside the cockpit, the pilot waited, hands ready on the controls. The second startup began. The engine whined, lower than before. A few people held their breath. Then the sound died again, more decisively this time. Like a clear answer, silence spread, thick and heavy. There was no laughter, no small exchanges. All eyes were fixed on the Apache standing motionless in the middle of the hangar. Derek Voss appeared at the front, his face tightening. He strode over, glanced at the control panel, then turned to the crew. "What is going on?" a technician replied, his voice uncertain. "The system is reporting a fault, sir, but we haven't identified the cause yet." Voss frowned. "It's just a minor software glitch." He said it loudly, more to reassure those around him than to answer the question. "How do you people work that this kind of nonsense shows up on inspection day?" Another technician spoke up carefully. "We're rechecking the entire cycle. Sir, do it fast." Voss snapped. "I don't want to hear any more excuses." He paced in a small circle, hands on his hips, eyes sweeping across the hangar, heads lowered further. No one wanted to be the next target. Voss stopped near the temporary desk and glanced at the prepared folder. The numbers, the neat lines of text that once felt reassuring, now seemed to have lost their comfort. At the edge of the hangar, Elias stood still. He did not look at the screens. He listened. The engine sound just now, the length of the whine, the pause between beats, all came together into a familiar picture in his mind. He heard a small instability, small enough for software to ignore, but large enough for the aircraft to refuse to cooperate. A young technician ran past Elias, speaking quickly to a colleague. "The software says there's no critical fault." Elias frowned slightly. He looked toward the engine bay, where the lights illuminated deep, hidden joints. He knew this feeling, a failure that lived not in lines of code, but in the contact between metal and metal, between design and reality. Inside the cockpit, the pilot removed his headset, opened the canopy, and jumped down. He spoke to Voss, his voice controlled with effort. "The aircraft isn't right. I'm not taking it into the air like this." Voss spun around. "What are you talking about? This is inspection day." "I know," the pilot replied, "but I also know when an Apache isn't ready." That statement made a few people exchange glances. No one said anything else. Voss took a deep breath, then nodded stiffly. "Fine. Check it again. Fast." The technicians returned to their tasks. Cables were disconnected and reattached. Modules were inspected and reinstalled. The diagnostic screens continued to display familiar, emotionless lines of text. There were no warnings large enough to explain the problem. Elias stepped aside, pulling the floor sweeper back a few steps. He kept his distance, but his eyes never left the Apache. He listened to every small sound, every faint touch of metal on metal. Old years returned vividly, when he had stood under fire, listening to aircraft with his whole body, not just his ears. "Does anyone see anything?" a technician asked, frustration in his voice. No one answered. Voss checked his watch, then looked toward the hangar doors, where senior officers could appear at any moment. His jaw tightened, his voice dropping. "We don't have time for this." Elias heard those words. He knew the pressure weighing on Voss was not just the inspection, but an entire path of promotion built on polished reports. He also knew the Apache did not care about reports. It only responded to reality. The engine remained silent. LD and indifferent. The hangar stood unchanged, lights shining down. Time dragged on, each second stretching longer. If the Apache did not fly, everything would stop here, and Elias understood clearly that what was at risk of collapsing was not just an inspection. Time began to crawl unpleasantly inside the hangar. Every minute stretched longer than usual, as if the Apache standing motionless there were deliberately testing the patience of everyone present. The lights were still on, but the atmosphere had changed. The initial confidence was gradually eroded, giving way to a growing sense of unease, spreading through every glance. The technicians fanned out around the Apache 19042. One module was removed and placed on a metal table. Another module was brought over and installed with quick, precise movements. The sound of tools clinking together rang out steadily, more hurried than before. Everyone worked as if speed alone could compensate for uncertainty. Run the diagnostics again, someone said. The screen lit up, familiar lines of data scrolling down. One technician leaned in close, reading each parameter carefully. He exhaled, half relieved and half confused. No critical fault detected. The sentence echoed through the hangar, not loud, but loud enough for several people to hear. It carried an uncomfortable paradox. On paper, on the screen, everything was fine. Right in front of them, the Apache remained silent. Inside the cockpit, the pilot tightened his harness and stared at the glowing red instrument panel. He muttered a curse, low but clear. Damn it. Then he looked up, his voice sharper. These numbers mean nothing if the aircraft does not fly. Derek Voss stood nearby, the tension plain on his face. He stepped forward, snatched the diagnostic sheet from the technician's hands, scanned it, then threw it back onto the table. What kind of training did you people get? No one answered right away. Someone opened his mouth, then stopped. Their eyes drifted away, settling on the screen. The tools, anything but Voss's face. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice rising slightly. I need results, not explanations. A young technician moved closer to his colleague and lowered his voice, just enough for those nearby to hear. The system says there is no critical fault. The words were like a life buoy thrown in desperation. They carried the hope that the problem was only temporary, that with a few more steps, everything would fall back into place. Voss heard it. His jaw tightened. He spun around, eyes cold and sharp. I do not need the system to teach me how to command. His voice was heavy and firm, more a declaration than a reply. The system does not answer to my superiors. I do. He turned away, took a few steps, then stopped to check his watch. Each glance made the pressure grow heavier. Carefully prepared reports, flawless lines of text, beautiful figures. All of it was at risk of becoming meaningless, because one aircraft refused to take off. At the edge of the hangar, Elias still stood beside the floor sweeper. He did not move closer and was not called by name, but his eyes never left the Apache. He followed every movement of the technicians, every module removed and reinstalled. He listened to the brief exchanges, the sighs held back. When a technician bent down near the engine bay, Elias leaned slightly, as if trying to see more clearly. His gaze settled on the grounding panel, where a metal cable connected the aircraft's body to the system. It sat in an unremarkable position, easy to overlook among the many complex components. Elias frowned, not because he was certain, but because a familiar feeling had surfaced. Something about the way the light reflected off that metal surface made him uneasy. A slightly different shade, a faint dullness, not clear enough for the software to flag as a problem. Another technician hurried over and reported quickly. Replacing the module did not change anything. Voss waved his hand. Then replace another one. Check everything again. We have already done almost all of it. Sir, do it again, Voss replied, until it runs. His voice no longer held its initial calm. It was rushed, openly irritated. A few people exchanged looks, then returned to their work, even though everyone knew they were repeating steps already taken. The pilot climbed down from the cockpit, removed his helmet, and set it down hard on the seat. I will say it again, he said, looking straight at Voss. I am not flying this aircraft until the cause is found. Voss looked at him, his eyes darkening. You are making things difficult for the entire unit. I am keeping things safe, the pilot answered, his voice not raised but firm. For me, and for everyone else. The words tightened the atmosphere even further. Voss turned away, not answering immediately. He knew arguing here would only make things worse. He needed a solution, fast, clean, enough to get through today. Elias watched from a distance. He knew the feeling of that pilot, knew the difference between a stable number and an aircraft that was truly ready. He also knew that the grounding panel was being ignored because it did not produce a clear warning. A technician crouched near the engine bay, touched a few connections, then stood up. Nothing unusual. Elias took a deep breath. He looked again at the grounding panel. The sense of unease was still there, persistent. He knew that if he spoke up now, in this situation, his words would not be taken seriously. A floor sweeper interfering with technical work on inspection day was not something the system was prepared to accept. Voss turned back, his voice lower but heavy. We are under scrutiny. I will not accept failure because of minor details. But, sir, a technician said, cautiously. What if that minor detail makes the aircraft unsafe? Voss stared at him. Do you have proof? The man fell silent. Elias witnessed it all. He saw clearly how the truth was pushed aside by pressure, by rank, by fear of responsibility. He saw the grounding panel still there, silent, like an answer that had been forgotten. Time continued to pass. The hangar remained lit. The Apache remained still. The truth was right there, within reach. But no one dared to look straight at it. The hangar door opened at a moment no one expected. There was no prior announcement, no ceremony. Colonel Marcus Ellison stepped inside, his manner calm, his footsteps firm against the concrete floor. His mere presence was enough to alter the rhythm of breathing in that space. Half-finished exchanges came to a halt. The sound of tools striking metal grew sparse, then disappeared entirely. Derek Voss spun around sharply, almost by reflex. He straightened his posture and stepped forward quickly. "Colonel," he said, his voice clipped and clear, trying to conceal the tension that had just surfaced. "We are handling a minor malfunction." Ellison nodded, showing no haste. He remained still, looking at the Apache 19042 sitting motionless in the center of the hangar, then turned his gaze to Voss. "Report." Voss cleared his throat. "A random software error, sir. The system has not recorded any serious failure. We are in the process of fixing it." Ellison did not respond right away. He did not look at the diagnostic screens, nor did he ask further about procedures. His eyes slowly swept across the hangar, from the technician standing stiffly to the pilot, who had not yet left the cockpit area. The look was not harsh, but it was enough to make several people unconsciously straighten their backs. The silence stretched on. Voss began to feel uneasy. He was accustomed to receiving quick feedback, whether praise or criticism. This silence left him unable to tell where he stood. Ellison took a few more steps forward. His gaze stopped at the edge of the hangar, where a man stood beside a floor-sweeping machine. Elias had been there since early morning, barely moving, unnoticed. He rested one hand on the broom handle, his back straightening slightly as he realized that gaze was on him. Ellison spoke, his voice clear and even. "Second Lieutenant Elias Grant." The entire hangar froze. The only remaining sound was the steady hum of the ventilation fans. Every eye turned toward the far corner. A few people slowly turned their heads, as if they could not believe what they had just heard. That title did not belong to a janitor, and certainly not to the man everyone called the old floor sweeper. Elias stood still for a very brief beat, then stepped forward. His body adjusted on its own, back straight, shoulders squared. He snapped to attention with a reflex ingrained deep within him, the movement crisp and precise. "Present, sir." Voss looked at Elias, then at Ellison, his confusion plainly visible. "Colonel," he said, his voice lower now, "perhaps there is a mistake. He is a sanitation worker." Ellison turned to Voss. His expression did not change. "I am not mistaken." He looked back at Elias. "You remember this Apache, do you not?" Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then take a look for me," Ellison said, his tone like a natural request, needing no emphasis. No one voiced an objection. No one dared. Elias walked up to the Apache. He did not bring a computer, nor did he ask for data. He stopped in front of the engine compartment and placed his hand on the aircraft's body. The gesture made several technicians exchange surprised glances. To them, it seemed emotional. To Elias, it was how one began. He tilted his head, listening, not with his ears in the usual sense, but with a blend of experience and instinct. He crouched down and opened the engine compartment. The lights revealed connectors, wires, and metal surfaces that had once been intimately familiar to him in another time. Elias paused at the grounding panel. He lightly touched a connector and examined it more closely. A thin layer of oxidation coated the surface, enough to weaken contact, but not enough to trigger a major alert. He murmured a very soft sentence, almost to himself. "Here," a nearby technician blurted out. That spot the software did not flag anything. Elias did not answer. He took a cloth from his pocket and cleaned the connector. His movements slow and deliberate. He tightened it, checking its firmness by hand. Everything unfolded in silence. Those around him watched every motion, no one daring to interrupt. Voss took half a step forward, then stopped. He opened his mouth but said nothing. His confidence hung suspended between two choices, to object or to wait. Elias straightened up and turned to Ellison. "You can test it now, sir." Ellison nodded. "Proceed." The pilot returned to the cockpit and closed the canopy. The startup sequence was run again. This time, the engine whined more smoothly. The sound was even and stable. There were no abnormal pauses. Then the familiar roar rose, strong and solid, filling the hangar. Apache 19042 came back to life. A few people exhaled unconsciously. One technician muttered softly, "It is running." Warning lights faded out. Readings stabilized. The pilot raised a thumb through the glass and nodded. All good. Silence settled over the hangar, heavy as stone. No one applauded. No one cheered. They stood still, trying to process what had just happened. A floor sweeper had done what an entire technical team could not, with a single, simple, and precise action. Ellison looked at Elias, his gaze holding more than mere confirmation. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Elias stood at attention. "My duty, sir." Voss stood a few steps away. His face had gone pale. The polished reports, the smooth explanations, all had just been shattered by a detail he had overlooked. He looked at the Apache, then at Elias, as if only now truly noticing the man's existence. Ellison turned to Voss. "We will talk later." Voss swallowed hard. "Understood, Colonel." Elias turned back, closed the engine compartment, wiped his hands, and stepped back to his former position, as if everything were finished. But the atmosphere in the hangar had changed. Eyes began to drift toward him. Curious, cautious, uncertain, the silence remained, thick and heavy, and within that silence, a question began to spread, unspoken by anyone. Who, exactly, was this floor sweeper? Do not leave yet. The next part will show why the system began to fear him. The Apache's engine sound slowly settled, descending from a powerful growl to a steady rhythm, before shutting down completely. That familiar sound should have brought sighs of relief, a few spontaneous claps, or at least some exchanged congratulations. But inside the Fort Bragg hangar, none of that happened. Silence spread through the space, thick and heavy, as if everyone were standing before an event they had not prepared themselves to react to. A young technician stood near the engine bay, his eyes still fixed on the Apache that had just come back to life. His voice trembled slightly, unable to hide his confusion. How did you do that?" The question slipped out almost unconsciously. It broke the silence, but not enough to release the tension. Elias turned his head and looked at the one who had asked. His gaze was calm, without pride or hesitation. He answered briefly, as if stating the obvious. "Listen to the aircraft." Several people glanced at one another. That answer existed in no manual or checklist. It was not something diagnostic software could record. It left those around him both curious and uneasy, because it pointed to a gap between taught knowledge and experience that could not be measured. Derek Voss stepped half a pace forward, inserting himself into the newly opened space. His voice was cold and firm, trying to cut off the spreading thoughts. "Just luck." He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, as if labeling what had just happened. Luck was harmless. Luck created no precedent. Luck asked no questions. Elias did not react. He simply nodded slightly, as if accepting that explanation. But Colonel Marcus Ellison did not let it pass. He turned to Voss, his gaze direct, his voice calm but clear. "Luck doesn't fix an Apache." The words were not loud, but they were enough to make several people hold their breath. Voss stiffened for a brief instant, then forced a strained smile. "I mean, we can't rely on random cases like this," Voss said. "We can't allow a dangerous precedent like this to exist." Ellison looked at him without interrupting, without nodding. That silence pushed Voss to continue, even as he sensed he was going too far. "Procedures exist to ensure safety," Voss added. "If everyone acts on instinct, everything falls apart." A few technicians nodded reflexively, unsure whether they agreed or were simply accustomed to siding with authority. The pilot who had just stepped out of the cockpit looked at Voss, then at Elias, his expression hard to read. He said nothing, but the tension in his posture showed that he understood exactly what had just been saved and what was now being denied. Elias turned away. He did not take part in the exchange. He walked back toward the floor sweeper cart, picked up the broom resting against the handle. The motion was familiar and smooth, as if he had never left that position. He pushed the cart toward a remaining oil stain near the edge of the hangar and resumed his work. That image caused a few people to freeze. A man who had just fixed an Apache with a simple action was now bent over, sweeping the floor, as if nothing had changed. The contrast was unsettling in a way that was hard to name. It exposed questions that no one wanted to answer. Voss watched Elias with narrowed eyes. The open contempt from earlier was gone, replaced by a cold assessment. He was no longer looking at a man. He was looking at a variable, a flaw in a system he was used to controlling. An older technician standing near Ellison lowered his voice. "Sir, should we record this incident?" Ellison looked at Elias once more, then turned back. "We'll discuss it later," he said. "For now, finish the inspection." That statement ended all debate. Everyone returned to their positions. The checks continued, but the rhythm had changed. The earlier false confidence was gone, replaced by a sense of caution, as if everyone were standing on a surface that had just cracked. Elias finished sweeping the oil stain and pushed the cart back to its usual corner. He set the broom neatly in place, then stood upright, waiting for the next assignment. No one called him. No one told him to leave, but no one came closer to ask anything more either. The invisible distance between him and the rest of the hangar seemed even wider than before. Voss walked toward the temporary work table and picked up the file folder. He flipped through a few pages, then stopped, his hand tightening. The figures inside were still clean, still perfectly within standards, but now he knew some things did not exist on paper, and those things had just revealed themselves in front of Ellison. "Major," a junior officer asked quietly, "how should we update the report?" Voss looked up, his expression quickly regaining control. "Record exactly what the system reports," he replied. "No more, no less." The other nodded in understanding. The report would be clean. What had just happened would be compressed into a few neutral lines, if it was mentioned at all. No one wanted to stir things further. From a distance, Elias heard that exchange. He did not turn around. He knew well how situations like this usually ended. The one who fixed the problem was not always the one who was thanked. Sometimes, they became evidence of a flaw the system wanted to hide. A young technician approached Elias, his voice low. What did you do before this?" Elias looked at him, his gaze neither cold nor warm. "My job," he said, "was to make sure the aircraft came back." The technician fell silent. The answer was too simple, and too heavy. He nodded, then walked away without asking more. Voss observed that scene from afar. He turned to Ellison, keeping his voice even. "Sir, I'll make sure this doesn't affect unit discipline," Ellison replied calmly. "I hope so." His gaze lingered on Elias once more, a little longer this time. Then he turned away and continued his work, but his presence, and what he had just witnessed, left a clear mark. As the inspection went on, no one spoke about Elias, but everyone thought about him. That floor sweeper had done what no one else could, and precisely because of that, he was not allowed to become a hero. The moment the Apache was saved, Elias Grant was marked as a problem. The duty roster appeared on the notice board when the night had already slipped past its midpoint. Fluorescent lights shone down on the thin sheet of paper, making the printed lines look colder than usual. A few people stopped to skim it quickly and then walked away, treating it as a familiar procedure. For Elias, it was a message delivered with neat efficiency. His name sat at the very bottom of the list. Night shift, command corridor. There was no explanation, no additional note. A valid adjustment, done by the book, sufficient to move one person away from the place where things had just happened. Elias finished reading, folded the paper back along the old creases of the notice board, and placed it back where it had been. He did not ask anyone, nor did he look for confirmation. At Fort Bragg, changes like this rarely required explanation. Another janitor standing nearby lowered his voice when he saw Elias still there. "They're pushing you out." Elias looked at the man, his gaze calm. "I'm used to it." The reply carried no fatigue or bitterness. It sounded like a truth accepted long ago. The other man fell silent, nodded, and walked away. Here, sympathy usually ended at that point. The night shift began when most of the base had settled down. Areas that were noisy during the day now held only the steady hum of ventilation systems and the sound of solitary footsteps echoing and fading away. The command corridor stretched long, with a low ceiling, sparse lights forming alternating patches of brightness and shadow. The air was cold and clean, lacking the familiar smell of oil and metal from the hangar. Elias pushed the floor-cleaning cart along the corridor. The wheels rolled softly over the stone floor, the sound small but distinct in the space. He moved slowly, evenly, as if time flowed by a different rule here. Each section of floor was cleaned, each stain erased, the work unfolding quietly. Portraits of commanders from different eras lined both walls, stern faces, straight gazes, names and ranks clearly printed beneath them. Elias paused longer in front of a few of the portraits, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. He cleaned the floor directly beneath those frames, carefully avoiding splashing water onto the walls. At one of the frames near the end, he slowed down. Laura Bennett, Deputy Base Commander. The face in the portrait looked younger than the image Elias had seen during the day, the eyes sharp and focused. He looked at the picture for a brief beat, then bent down and continued his work. The wheels rolled forward, the mop leaving behind a thin trail of water. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, then stopped. Elias heard them, but did not turn around. On the night shift, those who moved about usually had clear purposes. He continued cleaning, keeping his rhythm steady. "You're working late," the voice came from behind him, neither loud nor abrupt. Elias stopped his hands and turned around. Laura Bennett stood there, without an outer jacket, holding a thin folder of documents. The overhead light cast down on her face, making her look more tired than in the portrait. "My shift," Elias replied. "Ma'am." Bennett gave a small nod. "I know." She looked at the cleaning cart, then at the empty corridor. "They reassigned you here." Elias nodded. "Yes." Bennett was silent for a moment. She glanced around, as if confirming no one else was nearby. "You're already used to changes like this. It's not new," Elias said. "Just a different place to work." Bennett let out a soft breath. Fort Bragg has its own way of dealing with things that make it uncomfortable. Elias did not answer. He placed the mop into the bucket and wrung it lightly. Water dripped down, creating small tapping sounds in the corridor. Bennett watched him, her eyes carrying something difficult to name. "You're still wearing that ring," she said quietly. Elias looked down at his hand. The old silver ring was still there, its dull sheen catching the light. "I am duty first," Bennett read softly. "The instructor always said that." Elias looked up. "You remember?" Bennett nodded. "I remember more than you think." She paused, then continued. "I recognized you from the very first day." Elias showed no surprise. "Then why did you stay silent?" The question was asked gently, without accusation, but direct enough. Bennett looked toward the end of the corridor, where the darkness grew thicker. "Because there are things bigger than one person," she said. "The unit's reputation, funding, the positions of hundreds of people, and safety." Elias asked. Bennett turned back to him. "I believe the system will correct itself." Elias shook his head slightly. "The system doesn't do anything on its own." The air between them grew heavy. Bennett tightened her grip on the folder. "You don't understand the pressure of this position." "I do," Elias said. "I just chose differently." Bennett did not respond right away. She took a deep breath, then spoke slowly. "You should be careful. The night shift is a reminder." "I know," Elias replied, "but I still do my job." Bennett looked at him for a while longer, as if wanting to say more, then stopped. She turned toward the deputy commander's office door. Before going in, she spoke again, her voice low. "There are battles you can't win by confronting them head on." Elias watched her. "There are also battles you can't win by staying silent." Bennett paused with her hand on the door handle for a brief moment, then opened the door and stepped inside. The door closed behind her, the sound soft but final. The corridor returned to its empty stillness. Elias turned back to his work. He cleaned the floor beneath Bennett's portrait, then continued down the corridor. His shadow stretched across the stone floor, blending into the dark spaces between the lights. The night shift moved slowly, but it was not peaceful. Elias could clearly sense the invisible shift around him. Small, legitimate changes, neatly arranged. No one threatened him. No one gave direct orders, but the message was clear. As he pushed the cart closer to the end of the corridor, another door opened behind him. Elias stopped, not turning around right away. Light footsteps sounded. Then a figure stepped out of the illuminated area. The person who emerged from the darkness was not an openly declared enemy. The command corridor lay deep in the night. Fluorescent lights stretched into broken bands of brightness, enough to show each step clearly but not enough to warm the space. Elias pushed the floor cleaning cart slowly, the wheels gliding softly over stone polished by many years. Behind him, a door at the far end of the corridor closed after opening, leaving a heavier silence than before. The air felt still, almost watchful. Every sound seemed amplified by the emptiness. Laura Bennett stood there, a few steps away from him. She did not move forward right away, nor did she speak. Her eyes rested on Elias's back, as if weighing what she should say first, or whether she should speak at all. At last, she spoke, her voice low and restrained, nothing like the commanding tone she used during the day. "You have not changed at all." The words came unexpectedly. Elias stopped and turned around. For a very brief moment, he froze. "You remember me?" he asked. The question carried surprise more than pride. Bennett nodded. "From the very first day." She took another step, standing under the light. "The moment I saw you in the hangar." Her voice was steady, certain. Elias looked at her, unable to hide his surprise. He was used to being forgotten, to glances that passed over him as if he had never existed. Being recognized in this way caught him unprepared. "Then why did you stay silent?" he asked. The question was direct, without hesitation. Bennett tightened her grip, her fingers pressing into the thin folder she still carried. "The unit's reputation," she said slowly. "The budget. Hundreds of people depend on the decisions made here." Each word sounded measured, rehearsed. "And the pilots' lives?" Elias asked, His voice was not loud, but it was sharp. It cut through the reasons she had just named. Bennett turned away, looking toward the wall covered with portraits of commanders. "There are prices to pay," she replied. "There is not always a perfect choice." Her shoulders stiffened as she spoke. Elias was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice lower, carrying clear disappointment. "Staying silent in the face of wrongdoing is also a choice." The words landed heavily between them. That sentence made Bennett stop. She turned back to look at Elias, her eyes filled with exhaustion and something close to regret. "Do you think I do not know that?" she asked. "Do you think I sleep well every night?" Elias did not answer immediately. He looked down the empty corridor, where the sound of their footsteps echoed louder than their voices. "Knowing, and still doing it," he said at last. "That is what is hardest to accept." His tone was calm, but final. Bennett took a deep breath. "You always simplify everything," she said. "When you are in my position, you will understand." The argument sounded familiar, almost worn. "I have been in positions where I had to decide," Elias replied. "Different place, different circumstances, but the consequences are the same." His gaze did not waver. Bennett fell silent. She looked down at the freshly cleaned floor, where the light reflected in a long streak. "I thought the system would correct itself," she said, more quietly, "that small deviations would be fixed before they became disasters. The system has no conscience," Elias said. "Only people do." His words were simple, without decoration. That sentence made Bennett close her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked older than when she had stepped out of her office. "You do not understand the pressure here," she repeated, clinging to a familiar defense. "I understand the pressure when an aircraft is hit, and you have seconds to decide." Elias replied, "I understand the pressure of knowing that if you choose wrong, the person behind you will not make it home." His voice remained steady. Bennett looked at him and did not argue. Her justifications seemed to run dry. She leaned lightly against the wall, the folder in her hand, trembling slightly. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice tired. Elias looked at her, his eyes neither harsh nor yielding. "I want you to speak out." The answer was immediate. "And let everything collapse," Bennett asked. "Let a unit be investigated. Let hundreds of people be dragged into it." Fear edged her words. "So that one pilot does not fall," Elias replied. "So that one small error does not kill someone." His voice carried quiet certainty. Bennett turned away and walked a few steps down the corridor, then stopped. "There are things that cannot be said right now," she said. "It is not the time." Her back remained turned. Elias watched her. "The truth does not wait for the right time." His reply was calm, unwavering. Bennett gave a thin, humorless smile. "You are still as stubborn as ever." The words carried no warmth. "And you still choose silence," Elias answered. The exchange ended there. The air between them grew heavy. Both understood that this conversation was not finished, but it could not go any further tonight. Bennett turned back and looked at Elias one last time. "You should be careful," she said. "There are people who do not like being exposed." Elias nodded. "I know." The answer came without hesitation. Bennett walked toward the command office door. Before opening it, she stopped and spoke as if to herself. "I thought I was protecting the military." Her voice was almost a whisper. Elias replied, his voice low but clear. "The military is protected by the truth." Bennett opened the door and stepped inside. The door closed, leaving Elias alone in the corridor. A soft click of the lock sounded, then silence returned. Elias stood still for a moment, looking at the door. He understood that Bennett had made her choice, and the system had recorded it. He turned back to the cleaning cart and continued his work. Each pass of the cloth across the floor felt like a way of arranging his thoughts. He did not feel victorious, nor defeated. There was only clarity. Somewhere above, in brightly lit offices, decisions were still being signed. Reports were still being revised. The system continued to operate, quietly and efficiently, as it always had. But Elias knew that from this moment on, he was no longer a harmless shadow. Bennett had chosen silence, and the system knew it. The system also knew that someone had looked straight at the truth, and that knowledge made it cautious. Would you choose silence or speak out? Leave your answer in the comments. The next morning arrived early and cold. Fort Bragg woke to its familiar rhythm, disciplined and smooth, as if no conversation had taken place in the command hallway the night before. Elias received a brief notice requesting his presence at the occupational safety office. No reason was attached, no further explanation. It was simply a request made according to procedure. The occupational safety office was located in an auxiliary building, evenly lit, with white lights and no windows. The smell of new paper mixed with cleaning chemicals created a cleanliness that felt sterile and cold. A young officer sat behind a desk, a thin folder placed neatly in front of him. When Elias entered, the officer did not stand, only gestured for him to sit. "Let's begin," the officer said in a neutral tone, like someone reciting a memorized instruction. He opened the folder and turned to the first page. Record of safety procedure violations. Elias looked at the papers, then at the man across from him. "What violation?" the officer read aloud, each word clear and measured. "Unauthorized access to the technical area." Elias frowned slightly. At the request of Colonel Marcus Ellison, the officer did not react to that answer. He turned to the next page. "There is an additional note," he said. "Near chemical hazard incident." The words were read evenly, without emotion. Elias looked down at the page. The text was clearly printed, perfectly aligned, leaving no room for interpretation. He looked up. "Evidence." The officer paused briefly, then replied, "Procedurally sufficient." That answer ended any possibility of argument. Elias understood exactly what it meant. No specific proof was required. No witnesses were necessary. Only proper procedure, proper forms, and proper signatures. "You may add a supplemental statement here," the officer said, pointing to a blank box at the bottom of the page. Elias looked at the space, then shook his head. "No need." The officer nodded, as if he had expected that response. He stacked the pages, tapped them lightly into alignment, and slid the folder aside. "According to this record, your access badge will be confiscated pending investigation." Elias removed the badge from his jacket pocket and placed it on the desk. The plastic card struck the wood with a small, dry sound. The officer picked it up, placed it into a gray envelope, and sealed it. "The duration of your temporary suspension will be communicated later," he continued. "During this time, you are not permitted to access technical areas or any restricted zones." Elias nodded. He had heard enough to understand the rest. As the officer turned to the final page to sign, Elias noticed the signature at the bottom corner, Laura Bennett. He paused for a moment. His eyes did not linger long, but long enough to recognize it. The officer handed him a pen. "Sign here to acknowledge receipt." Elias took the pen and signed his name neatly. As he set it down, he asked calmly, "Did she read this record?" The officer looked at Elias and replied, maintaining the same neutral tone, "This is standard procedure." Elias did not ask anything further. That answer was sufficient. In this brightly lit room, any additional questions would have been meaningless. The officer stood, took the folder, and opened the door. "You may go." Elias stood up. As he stepped out, the officer avoided his gaze, looking to the side, as if inspecting an invisible detail on the wall. The hallway outside was quiet, filled only with the sound of footsteps that echoed, and then faded. The door to the occupational safety office closed behind Elias. The click was soft, but final. No one followed him. No one called him back. A meeting concluded cleanly, exactly as designed. Elias stood still for a moment, looking down the corridor ahead. He felt the change clearly, not in the space itself, but in how the system now regarded him. From a shadow, he had become an item to be processed. An employee passed by, glanced at Elias, then offered a brief nod. The look moved on quickly, never settling. At Fort Bragg, people learned very fast how not to see things that could cause trouble. Elias stepped outside. The morning air was cold and clear. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. On his hand, the old silver ring was still there. The words "duty first" appeared faint under the natural light. He recalled the conversation from the night before with Laura Bennett. The words spoken, the silences, the look in her eyes as she turned away. Now her signature sat neatly on a sheet of paper, legitimizing everything. No threats had been spoken, but the message was unmistakable. Elias turned back toward the command buildings, looking from a distance. Lit windows, people working inside them. He knew they were continuing their meetings, reports, and decisions. The system functioned smoothly, without any need for his presence. A voice sounded behind him. They moved fast. Elias turned. A technical worker stood there, looking uneasy. "I heard you were suspended." Elias nodded, temporarily. The man bit his lip. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Elias said. "I've been through things like this before." The man did not know what else to say. He nodded and walked away. The distance between them quickly widened with hurried footsteps. Elias continued walking, leaving the area behind. Each step carried the clear sense that this was not a misunderstanding. This was a message, delivered in the cleanest way the system knew. He understood that from now on, Every word he spoke would be examined more closely. Every action would be framed by procedure. No violence was required. No shouting, only paperwork, signatures, and a silent agreement. Elias stopped at the exit and looked back one last time. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He simply noted it. The truth had been spoken, and the system's response had unfolded exactly as he had expected. When he stepped outside, the door closed behind him again, louder this time. No one called his name. No one stopped him. The message was clear. If Elias Grant spoke out one more time, he would no longer be here to say anything at all. The full squadron meeting took place exactly as scheduled, at the right time. In the familiar room, the conference room was large, with a low ceiling. White lights shining straight down onto the long table where officers and technicians sat shoulder to shoulder. The atmosphere was tense, but orderly, like every other meeting at Fort Bragg. Only one detail drew attention from the very beginning. Elias Grant stood at the front. He was not wearing a uniform, just his familiar work clothes, simple, without insignia, without rank. The contrast made him stand out in an unsettling way. A few glances slid past him, and then turned away, as if looking any longer might invite trouble. Colonel Marcus Ellison sat at the head of the table, one hand resting on a stack of folders. He looked at Elias, then at the room. "We will hear the final technical report," he said evenly. "After that, I will conclude." Derek Voss sat on the right, arms crossed over his chest. The corner of his mouth curled into a thin, cold smile. He leaned toward the person beside him, low enough to avoid a whisper, but loud enough for a few to hear. "Let's just get this over with." A few chuckles sounded, then quickly died out. Elias did not react. He stood straight, his arms relaxed at his sides, his eyes swept across the room, never resting on anyone for too long. "Do you have something to say?" Ellison asked. Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." He did not step up to the podium, nor did he ask for a microphone. He spoke from where he stood, close enough for everyone to hear clearly. Voss leaned back in his chair, impatience plain on his face. "We are talking about technical matters," he said, "not personal recollections." Elias looked at him for a brief moment, then faced forward again. "Correct," he replied. "Technical matters." He raised his hand and removed a silver ring from his finger. The motion was slow and deliberate. A few people leaned forward, curious. The ring rested in Elias's palm. He turned it slightly, then separated a small inner piece. A data chip was revealed. The room seemed to sag inward. No one spoke. Voss narrowed his eyes, his smile gone. "What is that?" he asked. "Technical records," Elias answered. "Repairs that the system did not log." "You are talking nonsense," Voss said, his voice rising. "You do not have the authority." Ellison raised a hand. "Let him speak." Elias walked to the central control console. No one stopped him. He inserted the chip into the data port. The large screen at the front of the room lit up. A list appeared. At first, nothing more than familiar lines of text and charts. Then the details began to surface. Time, altitude, power status, warnings marked as low level, electrical instability occurring in mid-air, incidents noted as non-critical. A pilot in the front row blurted out, "That one. I remember that flight." Another voice followed, hoarse. "We almost had to make an emergency landing." Elias did not turn around. He let the data speak. The screen shifted to the next page. Electronic signatures appeared in the corner of each entry, repeated again and again, unmistakable. Derek Voss, Laura Bennett. No further explanation was needed. The room held its breath. A few people rose halfway from their seats, then sat back down. Those names were far too familiar to be dismissed as a mistake. Voss jumped to his feet. "This is unauthorized data," he said quickly. "Where did you get it?" "From my work," Elias replied. "From repairs that the reports did not fully reflect." "You are violating regulations," Voss said. "We will." Ellison stood. "That is enough." His voice was not loud, but it was firm. The room fell silent. Ellison looked at the screen, then at Elias. "Do you confirm this data is real?" "Yes," Elias said, "and I am prepared to explain every entry." Ellison nodded, then turned to Voss. "Major, would you like to explain?" Voss stood rigid. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes swept quickly across the room, across the waiting faces. "Those warnings were assessed as non-critical," he said at last. "According to procedure, one of them happened at 30,000 feet. A pilot said, 'I was there.'" Silence returned, heavier than before. Ellison did not speak immediately. He looked at Elias once more, his gaze carrying both confirmation and reflection. Elias stepped back. removed the chip, and slid it back into the ring. He placed the ring on his finger again. "I am finished," he said. There was nothing left to argue, no reason left to deny it. The screen remained lit, the figures and signatures standing there, bare and emotionless. The system had just exposed what it had tried to conceal. Ellison took a deep breath. "This meeting is adjourned for now," he said. No one leaves the room. No one stood. No one spoke. All eyes fixed on the screen, then shifted to Elias, then to Voss. There was no longer room for evasive words, no longer room for beautiful reports. The truth lay in the center of the room, with nowhere left to hide. The meeting room still held the same even white lighting, but the atmosphere had changed. After the data appeared on the screen, no one leaned back comfortably anymore. Eyes that once avoided the truth were now forced to face the screen. The figures, the familiar signatures, the truth did not need to be repeated. It was already there, long enough for everyone to read and understand. Laura Bennett stood up. Her movement was slow and stiff, as if her body were resisting the decision she had just made in her mind. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "I know," she said, "and I signed it." The sentence rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to sever any remaining chance of denial. A few people lowered their heads, others lifted theirs, as if finally allowed to breathe after holding it in for too long. Derek Voss sat frozen. The color drained quickly from his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no words suitable for defense now. Colonel Marcus Ellison rose to his feet. He was not in a hurry. He allowed the room to remain silent for another beat, long enough for everyone to understand that what he was about to say was not an impulsive reaction. "This system was wrong," he said slowly. "Wrong to let warnings be dismissed. Wrong to prioritize reports over safety. Wrong to force good people to stand outside the light." No one objected. No one interrupted. Ellison looked around the room, stopping at Voss, then at Bennett. "The decision is announced now," he said. "Major Derek Voss is demoted and reassigned, effective immediately." Voss looked up, his lips trembling. Colonel Ellison raised a hand. "There is no need." The room fell silent. A few people looked at Voss, not with pity, but with belated understanding of the cost of polished reports. Bennett took a deep breath, then continued, her voice low but clear. "I request to step down from my position as Deputy Base Commander." A faint murmur rippled through the room, then faded. Ellison nodded. "The request is noted." Elias stood still at the front, a few steps away from the control table. He did not step forward, did not insert himself. The decisions just made were not what he sought. Ellison turned to him. "Second Lieutenant Grant," he said, "you did what many people here did not. The base will compensate you for what you endured." Elias looked at Ellison, then at the room. His gaze rested on a few familiar faces, people who had once worked beneath the Apache, who had returned home because of small decisions. He shook his head. "I do not need compensation." Ellison frowned slightly. "Are you certain?" "Yes," Elias replied. "I only want to retrain the technicians." The statement made several people look up. Ellison paused for a beat. "Be specific." "A combined program," Elias said. "Old skills and new technology. Teaching how to read data and how to listen to the aircraft. No pay. I will serve as an instructor." A young technician standing in the back blurted out, "You will do it without pay." Elias turned and nodded. "I have already been paid enough by everyone making it home." Ellison looked at him, his eyes openly showing respect. "The proposal is approved." Bennett looked at Elias, her eyes moist, but without tears falling. "I am sorry," she said, softly enough that only a few heard. Elias nodded. "What matters is what happens next." Ellison turned back to the room. "The meeting is adjourned," he said. "We will begin fixing what was wrong." People stood up, one by one. There was no applause. No one celebrated. What had just occurred was not something to celebrate. It was a cut, one that needed time to heal. As the room gradually emptied, Elias remained standing, looking at the now dark screen. The numbers were gone, but their meaning was not. Outside, Fort Bragg returned to its familiar rhythm. Machines operated, orders were issued, but somewhere within it, order had just been adjusted. Not perfect, but necessary. Elias stepped into the corridor, where the light was softer. He stopped in front of a framed photograph on the wall, not to look for his own name, but to look at the faces that once represented power. Then he turned away and continued walking. In the days that followed, Elias appeared in the hangar in a different role, not a floor sweeper, and not a commander. He stood beside the practice bench, speaking slowly, pointing out each detail. "Data gives us direction," he told the technicians. Sound gives us a warning. Feeling gives us the decision. Do not ignore any of them. Someone asked. What if the system does not alert us? Elias replied. Then you must know to ask why. The program began simply, with no signage, no opening ceremony, but afterward, the Apaches took off with a different kind of preparation, not because the reports were better, but because the people beneath the rotors understood more clearly what they were holding. One afternoon, Ellison stopped by the hangar. He stood watching Elias instruct, then nodded to himself. No further words were needed. Elias ended the session, removed his gloves, and wiped his hands. A young technician stepped closer. Do you ever regret speaking up? Elias looked at the Apache ahead, his expression calm. If silence keeps someone from coming home, then speaking up is never regret. The story did not end at Fort Bragg. It continued elsewhere, wherever people stood before the choice between silence and truth. Each time someone chose to speak, the system was forced to adjust a little more, not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they understood their responsibility. Before leaving the hangar, Elias turned back for one last look. He spoke, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. Do not let good people stay silent just to survive. Some stories do not end when the character leaves the frame. They continue living in the small choices each person must face afterward. At Fort Bragg, Elias Grant did not seek fame, nor did he wish to become a symbol. He simply did what he believed was right, even when the price was being pushed to the margins, surrounded by silence, treated by the system as an anomaly to be removed. This story is not about an Apache, nor about a military base. It is about how power operates when left unexamined, and about ordinary people patient enough to wait until the truth speaks for itself. Each time someone chooses silence, wrongdoing gains more space to exist. Each time someone dares to speak, even quietly, the system is forced to change. If you have followed this story to this point, perhaps you understand that truth is rarely loud, and courage does not always wear rank. Follow and subscribe to continue accompanying stories about people standing before power, about difficult choices between safety and what is right, and about moments when a quiet voice can create profound change. Subscribe, follow, and share if you believe that speaking the truth is always worth it.